Hi, my name is Christian Devine and welcome to Retro Review, a safe zone for physical media. Hope you're all doing very well. And we're going to continue on this episode a look at the Bruce Lee at Golden Harvest box set from Arrow. Certainly one of the greatest box sets ever released by any company. And the 4K restorations are just fantastic. And there's just so much extra supplements on there that I knew that it was going to take me a long time to go through the entire box set. And as I said, my previous two retro reviews about Game of Death and the final Game of Death documentary, that I would continue to go over, separate discs in the set just to get through everything. And you can go back and watch those two. I have a link down below. And those, surprisingly or not surprisingly, have been my most popular retro reviews. So let's not mess with success. And I always love talking about Bruce Lee. And this will act as a kind of tribute also to Chuck Norris, who passed away last week. And of course, Chuck Norris was made famous by Bruce Lee in Bruce Lee's directorial debut, Way of the Dragon.
Bruce Lee is back in the all-new fantastic adventures of the superhero he created in Enter the Dragon. Bruce Lee gives his last and best performance in Return of the Dragon, rated R.
Now, The Way of the Dragon is a very special film for Bruce Lee fans and for Bruce Lee himself, since it was the first film that he had total control over. He started a company, Concord Productions, and this gave Bruce, for the first time in his life, total control over his material. And the big boss in Fist of Fury had broken all Hong Kong records, and Bruce Lee, after a very disappointing turn in America, was finally on his way to becoming the global star that he knew he was going to be, actually, and deserved to be. And so he wrote, directed, and choreographed The Way of the Dragon. And it reflects so much of his personality that his wonderful wife, Linda Caldwell, now of course, she says this is her favorite Bruce Lee film because it's the most Bruce Lee film, and many people feel this way. Even though it's not as slick as Enter the Dragon and even Fist of Fury, it has a lot of charm and shows Bruce Lee's kind of evolution as a director and a writer and a fighter and a choreographer. And there's lots of wonderful things in the film. And of course, once again, as I mentioned, the Chuck Norris fight scene in the Roman Colosseum, which is really one of the most iconic martial arts battles of all time. And the set, the Arrow box set, you can pick up for only $3,000 and change on Amazon right now. But fortunately, you can get these 4K releases individually now. That's an outrageous price, but I knew that box set was going to sell pretty fast, because if any box set deserves to sell out, it's certainly Bruce Lee at Golden Harvest. Now, I was fortunate enough to see The Way of the Dragon, or Return of the Dragon, as it was called in America, to capitalize on the success of Enter the Dragon. And because Bruce Lee had obviously passed away, it was kind of also like a nod, like, here he is, he's back again.
Boy, can we use him now.
And I saw all the Bruce Lee films in the theater around the time they came out, fortunately. I was very young, but I have incredibly strong sense memories of watching these films. They were, of course, Bruce Lee was very exciting to me. And also there was a lot of adult, material in the films. And it felt kind of risque for me to be seeing some of this nudity and violence, etc. And it was an opening to a whole new kind of, cinematic universe also. And I became very obsessed with Bruce Lee, as others have too. And although I don't, Return of the Dragon is not my favorite, Enter the Dragon really is my favorite. And just because it kind of encompasses Bruce Lee getting to, speak in his own voice, which is, worth its weight in, celluloid to me. And I love the fight scenes in it. I love all the Schiffer music, and there's just, obviously, it's a very iconic film. And as I've said before in my retro reviews on Game of Death, I have a strong appreciation for even the bastardized American release of the Game of Death. And this film is much more, Way of the Dragon has a lot of kind of comedy in the beginning, kind of a country bumpkin with Bruce Lee coming to Rome to help out his family's restaurant, which for some reason is under threat by the mob, who have nothing better to do apparently than to try to take over this poor Chinese restaurant. The food must be amazing. And so the first part of the film is kind of this fish out of water, and then it becomes a little more action oriented, and then it becomes a little grimmer and darker towards the end. And in a way, it's also the evolution of Bruce Lee as a filmmaker, because it starts off a little bit choppy and unsure and somewhat amateurish in certain moments, because they had to film scenes in Rome with a handheld camera on the fly, and some of the shots are out of focus, and the handheld work just doesn't look that great because it's just so clearly kind of awkward. And Bruce Lee's confidence as a director just gets more and more pronounced in the film, all the way up into the glorious fight scene in the Roman Colosseum with Chuck Norris. So that's one of the pleasures of the film, is to see kind of Bruce evolve as a filmmaker as you're watching the film itself. And there's some terrific fight scenes. The fight scenes in the alley with the mafia gang members is pretty memorable. And it has, Bruce Lee's got a lot of humor in this film, and I particularly love the thug who tries to use the nunchukas, and we know what happens next. And special mention must go out to Ping Ao Wai as the rather fey assistant to the mafia henchman. And there's Bob Wall in there, who would later show up, of course, in Enter the Dragon. And then, of course, Chuck Norris.
I'm Chuck Norris, and I've been waiting a long time to get my hands on John Stanley, who's making me sit through those horror movies night after night. You're lucky I'm a peace-loving man.
I'll get better movies, Chuck!
Just to talk about Chuck Norris for a moment here, this one, of course, put him on the map. He made a few films after this and then kind of blew up with Good Guys Wear Black, which I remember seeing the commercials for. I didn't see it in the theater at the time, but it certainly was a pretty big hit. And those commercials are pretty ubiquitous and iconic, with the shot of Chuck Norris flying into the car through the windshield. And he made multiple series of films after that. And the films that I did see in the theater were Code of Silence, which is pretty much Chuck Norris's best film, directed by Andrew Davis, who did The Fugitive later, and it's a very smart, well-made, more cop thriller than kung fu movie. Very little kung fu action in the film, but that's how good it is. It just works as a straight movie. It's a great cast, and even Roger Ebert praised it as a superior thriller. And if you haven't seen Code of Silence, definitely check it out.
Code of Silence is remarkable mainly because it does exactly what a thriller is supposed to do, and these days, that's remarkable. It gives us interesting characters. It tells a good story. It has great stunts and great action sequences, and I think that's what we want when we go to see a thriller.
I also saw Delta Force with Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin going from John Ford to Chuck Norris, is might be seen as a bit of a drop, but it's a very fun film about this team taking on terrorists on an airplane, with Robert Forster playing a bad guy, and Shelley Winters and Martin Balsam also in there. And then, of course, Invasion USA, which is, kind of the peak Red Dawn, Ruskies Are Coming film, which is much funner than Red Dawn. It's a totally stupid movie, but I had one of the best times in the theater watching it. We just laughed and cheered through it. It's so dopey that you have to enjoy it just for what it is. And politics aside, it's ridiculous, but it's just an immense amount of fun. And me and my friends always had fun watching Chuck Norris films in the theater, and we kind of had a routine about saying, "Please, Mr. Norris, can you beat me up? Thank you for beating me up, Mr. Norris." I guess you had to be there. But I never thought that Chuck Norris had any sort of, charisma or acting ability ever. He never seemed to develop any sort of acting ability and always talked in the same kind of voice, but that just might be, his the way he speaks. And but I did like his fighting style, and he certainly was all over the 80s as an action figure. And one of the coolest things about Chuck Norris is that he was a regular guest on the iconic Bay Area Creature Features show on KTVU Channel 2, hosted by John Stanley, who was a pretty big horror fan and nerd and had taken over the show from the legendary Bob Wilkins. And I really appreciated the fact that Chuck Norris had come on the show and even appeared in one of John Stanley's mini-movies that he made. So it showed that he was a really good sport about appearing on a beloved horror movie show. And I did see Silent Rage on HBO quite a bit, which is a pretty interesting kind of Chuck Norris horror science fiction film. Pretty fascinating. It actually has some scary moments in it. It's one of my favorite Chuck Norris films. They did one, An Eye for an Eye, set here in San Francisco, and Christopher Lee's the villain. I had no idea. I just watched that for the first time a couple weeks ago. It's on Tubi. And I was like, oh, Christopher Lee and Chuck Norris. What more could you want? And pretty much after Delta Force, I checked out of Chuck Norris's films. And I'll tell you my Chuck Norris story, which I do have a great Chuck Norris story at the end of this retro review. So let's get back to Way of the Dragon.
Boy, can we use him now.
So the film, a very simple plot, but it does highlight a lot of Bruce Lee's skill as a martial artist and his skill as a director, which to me is very underrated because he's got a very unique choreography and a directorial style, and there's certainly a style going on there, and it's just amazing to see what he pulls together in the fight scene in the Coliseum, which is just really magnificent. And it's the first time also in Bruce Lee film that he shows a respect for his opponent. And it does play out like these, gladiators fighting in this old school Coliseum with this little cat watching. And it just shows the kind of where Bruce Lee was headed as a filmmaker, the kind of films we would have gotten. They would have evolved so much beyond just, typical, kung fu fight battles. And, so the character goes to this from country bumpkin to kind of, murderer. And it's kind of interesting to see how that character arc plays out. But in this film, he doesn't have the kind of, the ending that, he's forced, to pay the price for his actions like in Fist of Fury. And so we get kind of a happy, melancholy ending. Now, as far as the Aero 4K goes, this is a fantastic presentation. It's in Dolby Vision and it's HDR10 compatible. It's been restored from the original film elements. And it has the Hong Kong cut and the Japanese cut, which is a little different. The Japanese cut has different audio and different opening and ending titles. And I really like the song, hearing the lyrics in the beginning of the Japanese version. And there's multiple language options because of obviously the fact the films were released, in China across multiple territories with different languages. And new subtitles. There's 2 fantastic audio commentaries, highly recommended. You're going to learn more than you ever wanted to know about the films. And there's a great documentary, The Way of the Camera, about the making of the film. There's extra interviews with some of the cast, and just so much stuff. I don't want to go into all the details, but you can certainly, when you pick it up, you're going to find out how much great stuff is on here. And it's a couple of nights entertainment. And deep dive into the making of this iconic Bruce Lee classic. And the films really do look fantastic. I've been totally blown away by the look of these 4Ks. And growing up seeing it in the theater and seeing the various copies on VHS and DVD and Blu-ray, they always keep getting better and better. And the amazing thing is, no matter what quality you're watching, the mystique and the charisma and the charm of Bruce Lee still comes through. But there's something about seeing in this clarity that's really breathtaking, and it's kind of shocking how great it looks, even though they don't have the original negative apparently, but they still, what they have and what they've done with it is absolutely beautiful. So, I cannot recommend these films more. And it's probably going to be the last word on all of these films for a long time unless there's new elements discovered. So, highly worth picking up. And like I said, I love the battle at the end of the Coliseum, and there's a wonderful shot at the end when Bruce Lee defeats Chuck Norris. And it's just the kind of, style and camera work and vibe that kind of sums up Bruce Lee's, talent and philosophy as a martial artist, a philosopher, and a filmmaker. And so here's my Chuck Norris story. Is when I was living in Dallas, Texas, first started writing up for video games. I was hired by the great John Romero to work on his new game Daikatana at his company Iron Storm. And so of course when I arrived in Dallas, Texas, and I came to the office, I, for no particular reason, started asking everybody if they had seen Walker, Texas Ranger around. I thought it was funny, and I kept asking people all week long. And I was sitting at my desk at the end of the week looking out at my wonderful view of this restaurant bar across the street, and I noticed there was a bunch of film crews setting up. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what they're filming. And more crews started coming out. I started thinking, I just wonder. And suddenly, this incredibly huge, expensive, silver bullet-like truck just roared up to the front of the restaurant. And I knew what was about to happen. Because yes, the door opened, and Chuck Norris stepped out carrying a suit bag over his shoulder. And this family came out of nowhere, literally didn't know where they came from. A mom and dad and a son, and they rushed up with the camera. And Chuck Norris took a suit bag and threw it down to the ground, not in anger. And he grabbed the family, pulled them in, and they took a bunch of pictures. Then he picked up his suit bag and went inside. And I thought, wow, there's Walker, Texas Ranger. I saw my first week in Dallas, Texas. And I also just generally thought that it looked like a very cool way for him to deal with his fans. He just went right with it, didn't act bothered or perturbed, and I love that he threw his suit bag down. So despite the fact that I later disagree with his politics, that's Chuck Norris to my mind, and I'm going to think of him as a worthy opponent to Bruce Lee in that gladiatorial Coliseum. So here's to you, Chuck, and here's to you, Way of the Dragon. And thank you so much for retro viewing. Please like and subscribe. That means a lot to me because it lets me know that you're out there watching and listening and that you care. And please comment if you have anything to say, because I love to read comments and I'll reply to everything you ask or are curious about. So once again, thank you so much for retro viewing, and thank you, Mr. Norris, for all the kicks.